Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carrot Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2013 fantasy adventure movie titled The Hobbit The Desolation of Smaug. Now, The Hobbit The Desolation of Smaug runs for 2 hours and 41 minutes long. It is directed by Peter Jackson. The script was done by Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Guillermo del Toro. It is based off of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. It is produced by Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Caroline Cunningham, and Zach Weiner. It is composed by Howard Shore, the cinematography by Andrew Lesnie, and it was edited by Jabez Olson. And the stars of the movie are Martin Freeman, Ian McKellan, Richard Armitage, Benedict Cumberbatch, Evangeline Lilly, Lee Pace, Luke Evans, Ken Stott, James Nesbitt, and Orlando Bloom. So, after the somewhat intriguing and satisfying first part of the Hobbit trilogy, An Unexpected Journey, it just kind of comes to a point where we can have too much, too far, and that's not necessarily a good thing, mind you. But apparently, Peter Jackson at this point has gone on too far, where his self-admiration has led to the Hobbit trilogy become nothing more than just a cash grab that will cater to Tolkien aficionados, but not necessarily pander to the average moviegoer. Yes, indeed. Peter Jackson, of course, thought that with the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which actually was well-deserved of a trilogy, I can't say too much about The Hobbit being too much of a trilogy, because to me personally, The Hobbit will always be second fiddle to Lord of the Rings. And maybe it would have been better if they would have just made it into one big long epic 4-hour movie instead of just 3 trilogies. There was no need for it. The Hobbit as a standalone would have been just fine. But since Peter Jackson, who felt that, hey, if the Lord of the Rings could work, why not the Hobbit? But it just doesn't work that way. Is it because Peter Jackson needed the money or something? That he just needed to make this into a trilogy? I find it inconvenient and not very necessary. While the Lord of the Rings trilogy makes a lot of sense because there was a lot of ground to cover and it was handled with a lot of care and precision. With the success of An Unexpected Journey, Jackson decided to give The Hobbit the same kind of treatment and turned that movie, into an unnecessary trilogy. And sure, it did wonders to continue from where it left off, but by then fans started to become, pretty much tired and just wanted to, move forward. But instead you have The Unexpected Journey, The Desolation of Smaug, and the Battle of the Five Armies. And we just don't necessarily need that. So he thought he would do good by bringing back the performers from the previous outing and pad on more material from the epilogue of the J.R.R. Tolkien's work. And yes, he also added new things that was not in Tolkien's book. Adding new characters, adding new side stories that just didn't really work. I mean, with the Desolation of Smaug, I was hoping that we would see an epic battle between the dwarfs, Bilbo Baggins, Gandalf taking on this this big bad scary dragon who's hiding in a castle filled with gold coins. I'm sure the diehard fan base will likely have a blast because let's face it, this movie was catered towards Tolkien lovers or people who adored the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, and and you know what, I I am okay with that. I mean, if this is your cup of tea, the more power to you. And I will admit, An Unexpected Journey was very enjoyable to watch, albeit very long for the narrative to get really excited. However, The Desolation of Smaug takes a while to get you invested. In fact, you have to wait until the final hour before it really starts to feel like an enchanting sequel. But until then, the first 100 minutes is nothing more than just padded on filler, which can be quite taxing and anticlimactic. And that's just kind of like what it was. Now, listen, I'm not going to go over the plot, assuming you know it already. But if you're not familiar with the plot, you might be sitting there for the next 3 hours, absolutely flabbergasted into what the fuck is transpiring here. In An Unexpected Journey, at least we have a straightforward tale of how a young Bilbo Baggins, played by Martin Freeman, gets recruited by Gandalf the Grey, played by Ian McKellan, to assist the dwarfs in finding the missing treasure that's being held under hostage by the dragon Smaug. In this outing, Bilbo is shamefully not heavily utilized as much, and the film seems to depend on a bunch of side characters doing random subplots that surround the focal point of the narrative. It just seems to meander too much. And there are times when it kind of looks more like something taken out of a video game because the CGI is just overkill. If I wanted to see an abundance of CGI bullshit, I could just simply sit down and watch a 3D movie. A 3D animated movie. But no, it's just that there's just way too much CGI and not enough room for performances. Sure, there was CGI in An Unexpected Journey, but this one actually takes it to more of a greater notch that just doesn't seem to fit through people who want to see simple storytelling. At least in The Lord of the Rings, the CGI was not as overkill. But then again, Lord of the Rings came out in 2001 to 2003. And back then, CGI was not so heavily dependent. Here, it actually just goes to show you how much the film industry has changed between 2001 to 2013. It's like everything just came by in a rush. The most overwhelming subplot stems from the unnecessary romantic triangle between the dwarf Kili, played by Aidan Turner, the tough but pretty elf Toriel, played by Evangeline Lilly, and the returning badass Legolas Greenleaf, played by Orlando Bloom. And after 100 minutes and counting, Bilbo finally makes it to the dragon's domain, hoping to see a possible epic clash. But we never get to see too much of that. Sure, we get to see a full live view of the dragon, and it does actually have some exciting moments to it. But I guess the climax, you're just gonna have to wait till the next sequel to close up the trilogy. I mean, this is actually kind of like one of those victims of middle trilogy doom, because it seems like the first part gets you invested, the second part tends to teeter, and then when you get to the third part of a trilogy is when all hell breaks loose. And that's kind of like what you get in a lot of these epic fantasy trilogies. Here, I guess you kind of get that kind of same treatment. The major red herring about the Hobbit trilogy was that Jackson let his fame and success get into his head just a bit too far. If anything, it should have been a standalone 3-hour epic adventure movie that has a wonderful pace and momentum. All this padding on is just overkill because it just stretches things out more than it should, and by doing that, the momentum goes into complete oblivion. I get it. Jackson is enthusiastic about the work of Tolkien, and who can blame him? A lot of people would do anything to bend over backwards and to do something based off of The Hobbit. I mean, sure, Jackson wasn't really into directing it. I mean, it was originally Guillermo del Toro who was supposed to direct the Hobbit trilogy, and that Jackson was going to take a back seat and do a production work. But nonetheless, he got suckered back in, and he just decided, hey, let's do the same treatment like we did with Lord of the Rings. But it just doesn't always work that way. He just made it so obvious that he just lost sight of the material from the book and just padded on his own brainstorms with really little to much thought or consideration, especially to die-hard Tolkien fans. Sure, those who worship Tolkien like a saint will chew into the storylines, however, others will feel completely lost and even bored. There are some scenes that just go on and on that could have been easily edited or cut. The padding takes its toll for the worst regarding the demise of Smaug, if that's possible. The story ends blatantly informing us that there's another unnecessary installment waiting around the corner. But of course, we knew that was going to happen because they're going to turn this into a trilogy. At least Lord of the Rings provided a bit of closure before moving on to the next chapter. Here, there really isn't any closure at that. And if they have edited some unimportant scenes, maybe there could have been something a little more better to come out of it. There are really only 3 scenes that stand out in this bloated sequel. The first being the epic battle with the giant spiders, which is always very fun to watch. The second being the dwarves riding the barrels down the wild river rapids, always fun to watch. And Bilbo making it to the top of the mountain that leads to Smaug's cave, that's also filled with millions of gold coins. It's the only scenes that really tend to stand out. Other than that, we really don't have much to get engaged about. And the rest is all nothing more than filler, at least the scenes that don't involve Bilbo. Lots of unnecessary things that were put in there, that were padded in there, that really didn't need to be featured in the sequel. Now, will the trilogy lead to an epic clash, an epic battle, and some form of disclosure to this chapter? I mean, I've always been a big fan of The Hobbit, perhaps maybe more so than Lord of the Rings, but the difference is that The Lord of the Rings is featured to sound like an epical adventure film. The Hobbit, to be honest with you, was more almost treated like a bedtime story you could tell a young child so that he or she can go to sleep. That's how The Hobbit is read like. The Hobbit has always been to me more inferior than Lord of the Rings. Is that a bad thing? No. I never said it was a bad thing. And if you want to make The Hobbit into a movie, fine. It could have been just a standard 3 hour, maybe 4 hour long epic adventure movie. It didn't have to go into three parts. That's really all I'm saying. Peter Jackson just tended to overdo his welcome, and it just sort of becomes a bit tedious and overwhelming. So therefore, when all is said and done, if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give The Hobbit The Desolation of Smaug a 4 out of 10. I can't say I really recommend this movie too much. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Carrot Rider saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.